Hi everyone and welcome to another video. So this time I want to find out how far you can push a used laptop for around 130 euros. I actually paid for this ThinkPad Lenovo 130 euros. The only thing I did was inserting an SSD because this makes Windows performance a lot better. However, we are focusing on gaming performance today, so let's first talk about the specs. In this particular laptop we have an i5-3230M CPU. Unfortunately, this is still of the time where these CPUs were just dual core and not quad core, so you only get 2 cores. At least it's hyper-threaded, so that's a bit of a kind of a good thing. It boosts up to 2.9 gigahertz, which in today's standards it's also not that high, but back in the time it was pretty decent. It also comes with 8 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. You could technically up it to 16 gigabytes or to DDR3 RAM is currently pretty expensive, so I wouldn't really go that way, and it's probably not worth it considering the rest of the system. So yeah, that's not really necessary. The real star of the show here, I mean, if you can call it that way, is the GeForce 740M. And yeah, you get right, this thing actually has a dedicated GPU, which is kind of unusual if you're finding low budget or used laptops in this price bracket. It even has 2 gigabytes of video RAM, which is quite remarkable for such a video card. Unfortunately though, it's just DDR3, so it's not as fast as the GDDR5 counterpart found in a lot of GTX models, and some newer models already even have GDDR6, so this is something to be considered as well. Otherwise, it's a pretty basic laptop design from this area, nothing special or so. It already has a 1080p screen, which is nice. Unfortunately, just a TN panel though. Otherwise, 1080p will be kind of a challenge for the 740M because this card was never be a high-end card, and this resolution is a lot to drive. So this is something to be considered. We probably will look into lower resolutions later on. So before we start up and get into the gaming benchmarks, just a quick side note here. I was able to overclock this GPU via MSI Afterburner. The highest I was able to raise the core clock was 135 MHz, which was basically stable with this card. And I also was able to raise the memory clock around 100 MHz. Everything else above this was causing me issues and crashes in the games. So this obviously depends on kind of chip you get. So this is something you can have luck with. In my case, 100 MHz isn't that much, so it's more like basic overclock, but it's still nice, so we can gain some more FPS in some games. So the first game I want to try was Valorant, and as you can already see here, this game runs perfectly fine most of the time. We can hit 60 FPS inside the game like pretty easy. I used medium to high settings and even 1080p native resolution, and the game still runs pretty decent. Only when some menus are open or so, and sometimes if the fight heats up, it's dropping a bit. Although if you can see, that's not the GPU but actually the CPU which is holding it back sometimes. So still I would call this game perfectly playable on this hardware. So next up we have CSGO. I opted for low settings with high shadow quality, and in the benchmark at 1080p we are fluctuating somewhere between 40 to 80 FPS, just ignoring the heavy drops with the smoke grenades. But you could get higher FPS when you drop to 900p. As you can see here, you can reach between 50 to 60 frames per second, which is quite okay, and I think it's absolutely playable as well. I think again it seems like the CPU is holding back more than the GPU, so I think going down to 720p won't gain any more. So yeah, but still I would say it's definitely playable still on this hardware if you don't mind dropping sometimes a little bit below 60 FPS. So next up we have Dota 2, and I opted for the second lowest preset here at 1080p native, but with a resolution scale of 65%. And in heavy action this game goes down to around 30 FPS, and if there's nothing going on you can hit about 50 FPS. The interesting thing again is that it seems not to be the GPU which is causing it, because as you can see here now I raised the resolution scale to 100%, so basically native 1080p, and the frame rate doesn't take as much of a hit as you may expect. So I think It depends. I mean, Dota is a game where you like can get away with 30 FPS in heavy fights. It's not like a first-person shooter, so for me it would be perfectly fine on this. But of course, I know that some people have different requirements on their frame rate, so this really is up to you. But I think it's still playable on this laptop as well. Okay, so last of the easier to run games, we have the Elder Scrolls Online. And in my experience, this game is usually CPU bound, so I was targeting 30 FPS anyway, since we previously just discovered that the GPU is usually not up to the task. Especially since Elder Scrolls heavily relies on single threading, and in towns it can dip even on higher end PCs below 60 FPS. So I opted for like lower settings still and 1080p native, but with a low subsampling quality, so it's technically not running at native resolution. But where, as it turns out, we are pretty obviously GPU bound. I wasn't expecting this, but the i5 still seems to have enough single thread performance for this game. So it was kind of playable, I think. Even in towns we were able to reach above 30 FPS. Visually speaking, the game still looks okay. I mean, the resolution is not 1080p, but this was kind of to be expected. It still looks nice though, I would say, and for a game like this, I think 30 FPS would be fine for me at least to play. So also I would call this kind of a success and would say, yeah, it's definitely playable on this laptop. Okay, so now let's move on to the more like heavy or heavier to run games, and the first one is The Crew 2. This normally requires a GTX 660, and just to put this into perspective in synthetical benchmarks, this one is about 2.5 times faster than the 740M in this laptop. Well, unfortunately though, it turned out that the game simply wouldn't work. It never used the 740M, but instead used the Intel HD integrated graphics from the CPU. I tried various tricks, including disabling the Intel HD in a device manager, and looked for different solutions online. Couldn't find anything, which is a bit of a shame, because it turns out even the Intel HD was able to run this game at around 10 to 15 FPS in very low settings, and everything like below 720p, everything on lowest. So it would be really interesting if we would be able to run this game if the 740M was being utilized, but unfortunately, yeah, it wasn't possible, so unplayable, we have to move on. So since The Crew unfortunately didn't work, I thought I'm trying out another game with similar minimum requirements, and this is Battlefield 1, actually also requiring a GTX 660 as a minimum. And here it turns out that the game actually kind of runs okay and above 30 FPS most of the time, everything on lowest. But unfortunately though, the CPU again is the bottleneck. I'm having a lot of stutter and like short freezes while playing, and this makes it a bit hard to play. I wouldn't really recommend to play it. I mean, single player you may get away with it. In multiplayer I think these stutters will just ruin your match, and I wouldn't really recommend it. If you can live with these freezes and stutters sometimes, I think single player, yeah, maybe, but it's definitely not a great experience. So unfortunately, I wouldn't really call it playable. So moving on to the next game, The Division 2, it's even more demanding, requiring a GTX 670 as a minimum, which is about 4 times as fast as this graphics card inside this laptop. So when I was in the menu, I was pretty surprised actually. We hit around 40 FPS at 720p and low settings, which include a 75% resolution scale, and it still looked quite okay. So with this impression I got into the game, and well, it didn't turn out that well. We hit around 20 FPS without doing anything, so this was basically just too low. I then got into the settings, reduced everything to the absolute minimum, including resolution scale to 50%. And it got a bit better. We hit 30 FPS a lot of the time, or even above, between 30 and 40 sometimes. But unfortunately, again, the CPU is holding us back. We had a lot of freezes, a lot of stutter. It's not really a great experience. I mean, if the CPU would hold up, I think it would be definitely playable, although it doesn't look that great, but it would be playable. But unfortunately the CPU is just not up to the task, which is a bit of a disappointment. I really thought that the 740M would basically bottleneck any game, but at low settings, as it turns out, it's most of the time the old i5 which is holding us back. So yeah, the Division 2 unfortunately not playable, but still interesting to see how far we can push the 740M. So the last game which will definitely fail was Watch Dogs Legion. I mean, this game requires a GTX 970 as a minimum, and this card is about 7.5 times as fast in benchmarks. So it wasn't really the question if we can even run this game, but if we can just start it. And to my surprise, we actually made it into the menu. So I had it into the graphics settings, reduced resolution to 720p, of course everything on lowest, resolution scale 25%, although I think it's still 50% internally. And then I checked the benchmark, and kind of to my surprise, the benchmark wasn't actually that bad. I mean, we reached between 20 to 30 FPS most of the time, and I mean, considering the minimum requirements, this isn't too bad at all. And with this kind of impression, I wanted to check out the real game, so I opted for like going into the city and checking out how it holds up. And well, just as in Division 2, things just starting to become worse. And again, unfortunately, it seems to be the CPU. Especially this game is heavy on CPU when you're like traveling and driving around, and frame rate can dip to 15 FPS, and sometimes you have like a lot of freezes and stutters which wouldn't be pleasing to play. Sometimes it can reach between 20 to 30 FPS, but when you're traveling or so, it's like really low FPS, and the freezes makes it kind of unplayable. I mean, this was kind of expected, still impressive that, I mean, it can basically kind of run at all, but yeah, unfortunately, of course, I wouldn't recommend it to play it that way. Also, this isn't really pleasing to the eye with this graphical settings. So yeah, there you have it. I still found this result pretty interesting and sometimes also impressive, considering that at this price point I didn't really expect it that any game will probably run at all. But as you could see, most of the competitive titles like CSGO, Dota and Valorant just run pretty decent, and I would call it absolutely playable. Probably you would get away with a better deal if you're considering a desktop PC, but if you like also consider that you basically would need a mouse, keyboard and monitor if you don't have anything so far, I think it's not too far off, and it's still a great deal if you consider all of this. Yeah, I mean, for basic tasks like web browsing and so video watching and so on, it's not a problem. You could easily do this with this device. So I think it's pretty interesting, and if you're just like a casual player and want to do some competitive stuff and don't want to play any AAA games from the last years, I think it could be quite an interesting option. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this quick look and maybe found also some of the results interesting or entertaining. If so, feel free to leave a comment or like down below, and hope to see you in some of the next videos. Bye!